This is Brittney Cooper. I'm back with my science fiction novel, Discovering Darklin. We are on to Chapter 1. Now, this is from the point of view of Jack. Another ale here, called Jack. He received a dirty look from the bartender. "Wait a damn minute, you impatient ass," she said over her shoulder and rolled her bright green eyes at him. She turned back, tucking her long dark hair behind her little rounded ear, and continued serving Carlin and Minka their drinks. They seemed to be in good spirits tonight. Minka and the bartender were chatting. Minka was Dana, the dominant species on Dania. She was a short woman with deep brown skin, blue jewel-like eyes, and long blue-black wavy hair. Hair that she was pulling out from under Carlin's muscled, brass-colored arm that was over her shoulders. Carlin stared dreamily at Minka and had no idea he had been pulling her hair. It was a strange expression to see on his face. He was usually moody or sullen, but since he started dating Minka, he had that dreamy expression more and more. They were an odd couple. In contrast to Minka's stature, Carlin was huge, almost a meter taller than her, bald with gray eyes. He was an ogren. There were far fewer ogrens than Dana on Dania. Jack smiled to himself. He was glad someone was happy. He sure as hell wasn't, especially now because he had an empty glass. "Don't take all night," he called to the bartender. She didn't respond. He looked up at the broadcast on the aging hollow screen, which showed the news about the latest outbreak. Corners of the screen were dingy from years of use, and the volume went slightly up and down by itself. The volume was currently very low and difficult to hear. "Bring the hollow screen controller with the ale." That earned Jack another dirty look from the bartender. The bartender's name was Giselle. Very pretty, not really his taste, but easy to look at. He smiled and raised his empty glass. He loved getting on the bartender's nerves. It passed the time for him. His current assignment ended up being fairly boring, but at least the bartenders were nice to watch, even though they barely gave him the time of day. Giselle, who was pouring Minka another Crimson Kiss drink, was fun to be a smartass with. She gave as good as she got. Now, Allie was another story. She didn't work the bar as much as Giselle, so he didn't see her as much, but had become a source of intrigue. Allie was taller than the other bartender with a curvier frame, short red hair, and big brown eyes that gave nothing away. She was very intense, like she was always holding something back that was fighting to surface. When she worked the bar, there was usually trouble. "Dead, we have received," blared the hollow screen. Jack jumped. He had been lost in his own thoughts. What the hell? Giselle leaned against the inside edge of the bar top with Minka whispering in her ear. Minka's hair fell into her drink, but she didn't seem to notice. Giselle had the hollow screen controller in her hand and was smirking at him. "That wasn't funny," snapped Jack. "We thought it was," said Minka. Giselle had turned the volume way down again. Back on the hollow screen, gruesome coverage was displayed. Even though he couldn't really hear the broadcast, Jack had a good idea of what was happening. There had been an outbreak every few years on a different planet. The current outbreak was on Laetera, which wasn't far from where he sat on Dania. It was the first outbreak in the Casmino system in years. Each outbreak was contained each time after thousands died. This one was just too close for his nerves to handle. He wasn't allowed to leave Dania, so if the outbreak spread here, he would have to abort his assignment and run for his life. If he failed his assignment, there would be horrific consequences. The thought made him want another glass of ale. Jack's employer wasn't the forgiving type. Jack looked down at his empty glass and wished Giselle would hurry up. The ale would probably calm the sick feeling he got when he watched the outbreak broadcasts. He glanced at the front door and closed his eyes and silently thanked the stars that she wasn't in the Casminos galaxy. Giselle was back in conversation with Minka and seemed determined to let Jack die of thirst. He raised his glass. "Giselle, another ale, please." She half turned to look at him. "Did you actually say please?" She looked stunned. He smirked. "I do have manners." Minka snorted. Carlin snapped out of his dreamy state. "What?" He looked around. He was completely lost on what had been going on, and Minka's snort brought him back to reality. She laid her small hand on his arm. "Nothing, babe." He stared at her for a moment with his intense gray eyes and settled back into his dreamy state with his elbow on the bar top and head resting on his hand. He was enamored with her. That much was obvious to everyone. "Ale?" Jack asked again. Giselle looked over her shoulder at him. "No," she said with a hint of a smile and resumed her conversation with Minka. She whispered to Giselle, "Is he always that obnoxious?" Minka slid a glance in Jack's direction. "Always," she said. Jack had overheard their exchange and smiled to himself. He liked being obnoxious. It made his job easier. Annoy the girls, and they pay more attention to his antics than anything else. If anyone ever discovered the true reason he was in Taddings, they would probably kill him. After he checked the broadcast again, which showed awful scenes of sick rooms, he looked around Taddings with its peeling papered walls and cracked floors. A perpetual liquor and stale smoke aroma lingered. A subtle scent of cleaner, kind of like lemon, permeated through the air. These poor girls were definitely losing the cleaning battle. The stools around the horseshoe-shaped bar had rips in the seats, and the bar tops had stains and burns on it. Taddings was a small bar in a 2-story building on a side street with barely any parking and a small sign with the name of the bar outside the front door. He wondered how Tadding kept this place open since it seemed to be falling apart. Ever since Granson Tadding opened Taddings, he did have a steady stream of paying customers who came in regularly. The regulars were wary of strangers. Jack had to endure a period of suspicion when he had first started drinking at Taddings a couple years ago. The regular bar patrons eventually accepted him as a local nuisance and left him alone most of the time. From the little that Jack had observed of the bar's owner, he preferred to be called by his surname. Tadding was always busy with meetings that seemed to have nothing to do with the business. The attendance to these meetings always changed, with the exception of a Ripso who was in and out every couple days but rarely bought anything. Jack thought this was odd because most Ripsos don't leave their home planet of Ripipso. It was rare to see Ripsos on other planets. The bartenders, Giselle and Allie, whom most patrons affectionately called the girls, never seemed to go to these meetings, but they always seemed to know everything going on. "Another ale here?" Nope, no response. He was getting thirsty. Minka and the bartender were busy discussing details for the upcoming nuptials. Looking around the bar, Jack saw that there was only a few paying patrons. 2 Layets had gone back to Tadding's office earlier in the night to one of the mysterious meetings. Probably something to do with the current outbreak on the Layets' home planet of Laetera. Jack had known Layets before he came to Dania, and their charcoal gray complexion was very distinct, but made them look like they were covered in ash. Jack was currently more interested in who was in front of him. Carlin and his girl Minka talked to Giselle. Well, Minka was talking to Giselle. Carlin had lapsed back into his stupor and stared at Minka. Giselle finally had Jack's ale in her hand. At least he hoped it was for him. Nolene swayed on her high-backed chair, about to fall over. She was served too much, but there had never been a limit on how much someone could be served. Although Nolene could really throw them back, even she had her high limits, which she hit quite often. Jack couldn't pinpoint her age. Her gray hair, brass-colored skin of an ogryn, and the constant sadness in her gray eyes made her look older than she probably was. Thalmet, Riordi, and his girl Annabelle were sitting on the other side of the bar, furthest from the front door. All 3 were talking over one another. Annabelle seemed to be winning whatever argument they were having, her short black hair whipping from side to side as she spoke to her fiancé, Riordi on one side of her, to Thalmet on the other side. Riordi and Thalmet both had short black hair, but that's where the similarities stopped. Riordi was Dana like his fiancé. Thalmet was an ogryn with an unusual with the usual ogre characteristics of brass-colored skin, tall, big-muscled, and a pleasant demeanor. Falmouth's politeness wasn't helping him in his current conversation. Annabelle was dominating the conversation, pointing her finger in Briordi's face, her red, jewel-like eyes looking like fire. Jack would be a little worried if she was looking at him like that. Uzel appeared in front of Jack holding his ale, finally, which had pulled him from his thoughts. He looked into her green eyes. She had a thin scar running from the outside corner of her left eye across her pale skin, disappearing into her hairline that was not successfully covered up. The bartender was definitely not a Dania local, but definitely very interesting to watch. "Here's your ale. That will be 3 paxets," Uzel said. "About time. I was parched." He smirked up at her. She smirked back at him. "How about next time I pour it over your head? Then you won't have to worry about drinking it." She set the drink down in front of him, like Jack thought. Interesting. She didn't put up with his crap and put him in his place. "You tell him, girl," said Nolene. Every word she said was slurred. Her eyes were only half open, and she was leaning sideways on her bar stool. Uzel shot Nolene a glare over her shoulder. "I don't need any help from your drunken ass." Nolene returned her dirty look after Uzel turned back to Jack and drained the ale in front of her. Jack saw Nolene had held up her glass to signal for another ale. Droplets of ale from the little left in the glass poured all over the bar top from the glass. Nolene was waving back and forth, practically turning it upside down in an attempt to get Uzel's attention. Jack slid the money to Uzel. "I think you got a mess to clean up." She looked confused, not a good look for her since it made her wrinkle her forehead. She hadn't seen what Nolene had been doing. Jack pointed across the bar. She turned around. "Oh, damn, Noel, what are you doing? You're making a mess." Nolene looked down at the mess Uzel indicated. She studied the bar top in front of her for a few seconds and pointed a big finger at it as she looked up into Uzel's pale face. "This?" "Yes, this." Uzel pointed at the mess too. Nolene seemed to be thinking, No, this was here before I got here." Jack laughed out loud. He couldn't help it. When someone was that drunk, it was just too funny. He heard a snort to his left. Several stools over, Minka had her hand over her mouth. Carlin was shaking his bald head. Minka's snorting must have shocked him out of his stupor again. Riordi and Annabelle were arguing. Falmouth was attempting to reason with Riordi. "You can't get mad. They work together." Riordi turned to look at him. "She spends more time with him than she does with me." Annabelle looked pissed, her red eyes flaring with anger. All 3 of them were completely oblivious to the scene playing out with Nolene. Uzel walked away from Nolene. Her face was a mask of calmness. She really was too used to the antics that took place in here. She didn't really let much of anything bother her. She interrupted the argument to ask if anyone needed a drink refill. "No," said Annabelle. Riordi slid his glass towards Uzel. I'll need another one." "I'm good." Falmouth nodded and began politely arguing with Riordi again. If you could really politely argue with someone. She just works with him. She loves her job. She's going to talk about it. Domic's part of her job, so he gets talked about a lot. "Chill out already. If you're pissing me off, I know you're pissing Annabelle off, and you have to go home with her." He was talking like Annabelle wasn't sitting right next to him, but she didn't seem to be speaking to either Falmouth or Riordi. She was sitting with her arms crossed, watching the holoscreen with a frown on her face. Armed with Riordi's ale, Uzel went back over to them and interrupted the argument again. "What seems to be the problem?" Falmouth stopped berating Riordi, and both guys looked at her. Before either could answer, Annabelle started talking. "Well, this asshole that claims to be my fiancé is pissed that I work with a man. I work at a med clinic. It's not a nunnery. It's not all women." The med clinic Annabelle was referring to was a few blocks over from Tadding's. It was as run down as Tadding's, a lot cleaner with a pleasant enough staff, but a hectic atmosphere because of too many patients and not enough supplies. Any kind of supplies that have to be shipped in from other planets are always delayed, or they disappear completely due to the humans' constant security checks. It didn't matter what kind of supplies they were, the shipping packages or crates were torn open, jumbled about, and rarely resealed properly. The humans were looking for weapons, illegal contraband, pretty much anything that could point to the location of the rebels. Since no one outside the human species is likely to turn on the rebels, the humans resort to some pretty low tactics such as searching hospital supplies, among other things. Annabelle had been in Tattings just a few days ago discussing ointment shortages with Giselle because they kept disappearing at the human security checkpoints. Jack laughed to himself as he thought about this. Who is going to smuggle contraband in ointment? But you don't have to talk about him, Riordan said. She rounded to face him. I talk about my job. As my fiancé, I would have hoped you would be interested and supportive, but I guess not. Why are you always talking about Dominic then? We work together at the med clinic and we are involved in the same area of work. She threw her hands up and looked around the bar. She just realized that everybody at the bar was watching her. Everyone except Nolene, who seemed to be asleep with her head down on the bar top. Annabelle got quiet and glared at her fiancé. He responded with an annoyed look. I just don't want to hear about my soon-to-be wife hanging out with another man all day. Jack could only hear part of Annabelle's response. True, I'm not... Giselle actually started laughing, which shocked the hell out of Jack. Giselle was usually very level-headed and down-to-earth and had a very level emotional range. She was personable and was a smartass, but outbursts of laughter or anger were rare for her. Giselle really was fun to annoy, which brought out the snarky comments he had come to like from her. He looked down at his drink. It is only his fourth ale, and only just now starting to get a buzz. Man, he was thirsty. He took a big gulp and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Ale was one of the best things humans brought from their world when they took over. The liquors and ales that were served on Dania and the other planets in the Backway Casmino system were worse than in the Kalos system, where more upscale liquors were drunk by the humans, but they got the job done. The bartender appeared in front of Jack again, looking disgruntled. I said 3 Paxes, holding out her hand, showing that he had given her 3 Emiras. I should just keep it. She exhaled through her nose, flaring her nostrils. She had just been laughing, and now she was getting mad. Jack could really get under her skin. When humans more or less conquered these systems and imposed their laws and customs on the native inhabitants of the Darklin galaxy, they adopted the native currency system, mainly because the materials for human money weren't durable enough to hold up against some of the planet's environments, especially the underwater communities. He laughed at himself at a mental image of a Brittney trying to use the paper humans used as money. It disintegrated since Brittney's entire civilization lived in acid lakes on Avakion in the Casmino system. They were an elegant race of what humans would call horses, but they had long fan-shaped fins instead of legs. They could leave the lakes, but preferred not to. Humans seemed to really like the gemstones already being used as currency in the galaxy. They seemed to think they were more valuable than they really were. Only 2 types of gemstones were actually valuable and would never be used as currency: thermojewels and diazas. Since gemstones could be mined on several planets, humans determined that implementing the human currency system was a waste of time and thought their time was better spent on policing the Darklin's galaxy's native inhabitants to the point of rebellion. Gemstone currency is made of 4 different gemstones: Paxets, Emiras, Lexits, and Caxons. The lowest currency were white and clear gemstones known as Paxets. 22 Paxets for each green Emira, 15 Emiras for each purple Lexit, and 27 Lexits for each yellow Caxon. Paxets were used for everyday items like food and clothes. Emiras could pay for temporary shelter and smaller ship parts. Lexits paid for shelter and ships. Caxons were rarely seen outside of the Kalix system. Humans hoarded them, which was easy for them to do, since Caxons were mined in one place, though Hiri in the Kalos system, and the Kalos system was all humans. If anyone other than a human was in the Kalos system, he or she was most likely not be leaving the Kalos system alive. I don't have time to keep track of your money for you. I already had to do that for Nolene, snapped Giselle. She dropped the small green gemstones on the bar top, and they bounced in 3 different directions. Jack handed over the correct gemstones. He was just a little preoccupied with everything on his mind and had given the bartender the wrong gemstones. She huffed and pocketed the money before she walked away towards Minka and Carlin. Jack was a little shocked. Was she stealing from tatting? That would not be smart. Giselle went back to talking to Minka. Are you coming? Minka asked Giselle. Giselle ran her hand through her hair. I'd love to, but I don't know if I can get away. Red and purple only. Wear no other colors or you will ruin everything and be told to leave. Carlin cut in. Already crazy. She just got the ring last night. Jack swept the emiras into his hand and put them in his pocket and glanced at the front door for about the 7th time, when a hand slapped down on the bar top. Allie, the other bartender, had slapped her hand down in front of Nolene as she walked by her. Wake up! Nolene had fallen asleep at the bar for about the 4th time tonight. These girls seriously needed to stop serving her so much, but the girls always tolerated more from her than anybody else. Nolene was just a sad, lonely drunk who never spoke unless she was pushing her drink limits, which she did quite often. Then it was hard to get her to shut up. She would ramble on and on about the poor state of everything, from the ale to the government to the weather. But once she was at that point, she really didn't make a lot of sense no matter what she said. The girls would interpret some of her ramblings, but Jack couldn't understand most of what Nolene said. Allie glared down at Nolene. Her expressions made Jack think she really didn't care for anyone in the place, almost like indifference bordering on disgust. Jack thought she was mesmerizing to watch. Even though most of her time Jack saw her, she was causing mayhem. Her short red hair fell into her big watchful brown eyes as she leaned towards Nolene. Her purple-colored lips pursed, looking angry, but Jack couldn't tell if she really was that angry or if she was faking it. Sometimes the anger didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes just looked sad instead. The anger was reaching her eyes now. She was pissed as hell about something. Nolane's head had snapped up off the bar top when Allie had slapped her hand down. Nolane's eyes were completely unfocused. Her head was bobbing and weaving, looking up at Allie standing over her. I do not need this bullshit. I'm a paying consumer, exclaimed Nolene. She pushed her empty glass over the side of the bar top towards Allie. As it slid off the side of the bar top, Allie caught it and slammed it back onto the bar top, breaking it. Do not break things that do not belong to you. Get out! Allie shouted at Nolene. Allie, barked Giselle and started towards her before stopping. Allie's shoulders seemed to tense, but otherwise completely ignored Giselle. I'm a-leavin'. I do not need no one in Tattings that night ever found out what Nolene did not need, because she stood up and promptly fell down, knocking the chair next to her into Minka's arm. Minka had been holding her reddish-colored drink in that hand and was turned talking to Carlin, so the drink sloshed all down the front of Carlin's shirt. He looked like he had blood all over him as the red drink soaked into his white shirt. Minka's mouth fell open in shock, and her blue-black hair whipped around so it was reflected in the dim lights of the bar, to look at Nolene sloshing the remainder of her drink onto the floor. Nolene was flat on her back. She had taken the chair she had been sitting in down with her. It was lying on its side next to her. She made a groaning sound but did not attempt to get up. Carlin exploded out of his chair. You drunken ass! His face turned as red as his shirt and stared at Nolene for a few seconds. You're paying for my shirt. He started towards her. Carlin, snapped Giselle. She was still standing in front of him and Minka, so she reached across the bar top for him but couldn't reach him. Allie grinned. Carlin ignored her and continued towards Nolene. Falmet and Riordi jumped up to restrain him. Each of them had grabbed one of Carlin's arms and held him back from jumping on Nolene. Since she was an Ogren, it probably would have been a fair fight if she wasn't so hammered that she couldn't stand up. Riordan was just a small Dana attempting to hold back Carlin's bulky Ogren body and having a tough time of it, even though he was much younger than Carlin. Riordan kept slipping in Minka's drink that was all over the floor. Thalmet, being an Ogren himself, was having a much easier time. You can't hit her. You'll get us thrown out, said Thalmet calmly. I don't care. He attempted to move forward and pulled poor Riordan off of his feet as he lost his footing yet again. Thalmet was the only thing keeping Carlin from pummeling Nolene, who was still on the floor. Riordan's effort was admirable, but completely unnecessary. You will care if you're never allowed in here again, said Giselle. Allie, help me out here. Allie only crossed her arms and watched the situation unfold. Jack watched this scene before him with fascination. This is just like one of those reality shows the humans watch. He thought Allie looked like she was actually enjoying this. Giselle looked pissed. Shut up, Jack, said Allie. Giselle glaring at her. That isn't helping. Allie walked out from behind the bar, dodged around a few tables that were set up outside the bar, and disappeared down the hallway on the side hall. Carlin strained against the hold Riordan and Thalmet had on him. Excuse me. Trying to get to Nolene. Riordan was practically pulled off his feet again. Nolene was immobile on the floor. She looked unconscious. Carlin realized she had passed out, and he began to relax. Thalmet loosened his grip. Riordan had completely let go, but stood ready to grab Carlin again if necessary. At that moment, Minka stood up and walked over to Carlin, still loosely held by one arm. She pulled her handbag off her shoulder, stood up on her tippy toes, and smacked him in the head with it. How dare you embarrass me like this? You can walk home. She turned and walked out of Tattings. Someone laughed. Carlin stood completely still. A shocked expression replaced the angry one. Thalmet released him. Riordan returned to his seat next to Annabelle, who had her hand over her mouth, who had very obviously holding back laughter. Serves you right, said Giselle. She had actually cracked a small smile. You're acting like Jack. Jack had been in a few brawls and tattings in the past, but he had never attempted to hit a woman, and had barely been involved in the broken arm incident. Don't get me involved in this, Giselle shot Jack a dark look that clearly said not to open his mouth again. Jack decided he wasn't going to speak again for a bit. Riordan and Annabelle had hauled a semi-conscious Annabelle to her feet. This was a feat. Nolene was a big Ogren lady, who looked to be wearing several layers of clothing. On the other end of the bar, Carlin sat in his wet seat, fuming. Minka's drink had gotten everywhere, his seat, his shirt, the bar top, and on the floor. Giselle went over to Riordan and said something. Riordan nodded and stood up with Annabelle beside him. Nolene was hauled slowly out the door, hanging practically unconscious between Riordan and Annabelle. They did not come back in. They must have taken Nolene home. Jack looked down and realized he had drunk all his ale while he watched the confrontation. He raised his glass to get Giselle's attention. She ignored him while mixing and pouring a blue drink for Thalmet. Thalmet was very strong, came in most nights alone, and was always available to help the girls break up fights. As a classic Ogren, he was very nice, but not very handsome. That always made Jack wonder how Carlin got Minka, since he was Ogren and she was Dana. Even though Ogren and Dana were both native to the planet of Dania, Danas were traditionally dark and beautiful, but abnormally short. It must have been for protection, since Dania was a rough planet to live on, but no one was ever dumb enough to ask Carlin. No one wants their face rearranged. Ogrens were like gentle giants. Carlin had just had a temper, and Jack had seen plenty of it over the couple years he had been coming into Tattings. His glass was still empty. Jack waved his glass back and forth. You can talk. Why are you always such an impatient ass? Giselle asked. It's a gift. She did not look impressed. She rolled her eyes and brought him an ale. Allie reappeared, followed by the owner. Tatting was a big guy, close to 7 feet tall, square-jawed and big-muscled arms. His brass-colored leathery skin gleamed under the bar's low lighting as he strode over to Carlin and pulled him roughly from his seat by his wet shirt. It was difficult to get Tatting into a temper, but there was no stopping him once he was in one. They came from the hallway to the back office, so Allie probably just interrupted his meetings with the Layets. This was going to be interesting. If you can't wait for Chapter 2, the link to purchase is in the description. Please subscribe for Chapter 2 coming next week.